I never spoke about this to anyone, and I never will while I'm alive. But this story has to be known someday. If someone is listening to this recording, it means I must have been dead for 30 years. Strange beings kidnapped and tortured me, experimented on my body as if I were an animal. But that wasn't worse than everything I saw, nor worse than what will come in the next century. My name is Michael Schmidt. I'm 38 years old, and I'm a history teacher at a secondary school in Heidelberg, Baden-Württemberg, where I was also born and raised. After inheriting my grandfather's house, who passed away 20 years ago, I've dedicated myself to restoring this family property that dates back to the 1920s. The structure of the house, with its creaking wooden floors and an atmosphere charged with past stories, has always been a place of fascination for me. On a rainy autumn Saturday, I decided to explore the attic, which was full of objects and memories accumulated over the decades. Among piles of old books and faded photographs, I found a dust-covered magnetophone. For those who don't know, a magnetophone is an old device used to record and play sound using a magnetic tape system. After carefully cleaning it, I investigated how I could make it work again. After placing a tape and adjusting the playback mechanisms, which involved manually rewinding the tape and adjusting the reading needle, I finally got it started. My grandfather, Thomas Schmidt, was a prominent figure in my childhood, although a man of few words. I knew well his stories about his work on the West Valley Railway line, but I always had the feeling that there were parts of his life he never shared. When my grandfather Thomas's voice resonated in the attic, clear and surprisingly young, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and awe. The recording, which I expected to be a mere recounting of family events, took an unexpected turn towards the extraordinary and terrifying. My grandfather began to relate an experience from his childhood that had never been revealed to our family. In the recording, my grandfather Thomas Schmidt's young voice begins his account with chilling precision, as if every detail were etched in his memory. My name is Thomas Schmidt, and what I'm going to tell you happened when I was just 10 years old. No child should have seen what I saw. I grew up in Heidelberg, Baden-Württemberg, in a quiet family, and until that day my life had been like that of any other child. Everything changed on a work trip with my father, Samuel Schmidt, a freight contractor who worked for the West Valley Railway line. Our destination was Munich, Bavaria. What should have been a routine trip to transport minerals and industrial supplies became the worst experience of my life. It was September 15th, 1930, in the midst of the Great Depression. The crisis had hit the entire country, and our railway line was on the verge of collapse, struggling to survive. Our train entered the Black Forest, a dangerous stretch we knew well, but which that day had something different, something that foreshadowed disaster. When we began to climb through the valley pass, the sky suddenly changed. It was as if someone had turned off the sun. An electric blue expanded across the horizon, and before we knew it, a violent storm broke out over us. The conductor tried to reduce speed when the first signs of the storm appeared, but it was useless. Suddenly, a monstrous lightning bolt descended from the clouds and struck our locomotive. Everything turned to chaos. Sparks flew through the air and the train came to a halt. I remember the sound as if 1,000 knives were tearing the sky while the train wobbled. Another lightning bolt struck the nearby mountains, causing a rock slide. The stones, huge as claws of an invisible beast, hurled themselves at us. There was no time to react. The train, out of control, crashed into the rocks. The impact was brutal. The metal twisted with a crunch that I can still hear in my head. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces. Screams of terror and pain filled the air. I looked around and all I saw was destruction, motionless bodies and blood. At that moment, as dust and smoke enveloped us, I knew nothing would ever be the same. Of the 25 passengers on board, 10 had died instantly. Their lifeless and disfigured bodies could barely be recognized among the debris and the twisted structure of the train. The other 15, including my father and me, had survived, but we were injured. Screams of pain, desperation, and confusion filled the cold mountain air, creating an atmosphere that seemed to worsen with each passing second. Some passengers, less injured, began to organize themselves. They tried to free the buried part of the locomotive, digging through the remains and looking for some way to call for help. The cold seeped into our bones, but before we could even understand the magnitude of our situation, something else happened, something that defied all logic. Suddenly, a white light, pure and radiant, began to make its way through the stormy clouds. It was so intense that we were all forced to close our eyes or look away. But that light was not like the sun or lightning. It had a different, strange origin. We didn't know it at that moment, but what we were about to see would change our lives forever. Space itself seemed to distort around us, and when I opened my eyes again, there above us, floating in the air, I saw something impossible. A colossal disc-shaped object with a small dome on its upper part emerged from among the clouds like an apparition from another world. It didn't look like anything we had seen before, as if a fragment of another universe had torn our reality, breaking the laws of time and space. But it wasn't just its presence that impacted us. There was something about it, an invisible force that exerted a strange pressure on us. 6 of us, as if we were under the control of an invisible mind, began to float towards the object, unable to resist it. Me, my father, a Lutheran pastor, and his daughter, a freight worker and an engineering student. We were all attracted. I felt as the light grew more intense, as if everything else in the world faded in its glow. My thoughts were confused and fear took over me, but I couldn't stop. We were puppets under the control of an unknown force. And then, in a blinding blink, darkness consumed us. I woke up in a cold place. Everything around me was strange and terrifying. The first thing I noticed was the lack of windows, of air, of anything that connected me to the outside. I found myself in a hermetically sealed room, illuminated by a dim light that barely allowed me to see the outline of the walls. I tried to get up, but something prevented me. My head hit against something invisible and solid. I was trapped in a kind of glass cell. It surrounded me completely. I couldn't get out. My breathing accelerated. Panic dominated me. It was then that I looked around and saw the other 5. My father, the pastor, his daughter, the freight worker, and the engineering student. They were there, but not like me. They lay motionless on stretchers, still unconscious. I didn't understand what was happening. Before I could process it, the doors of the room opened, and then I saw them. These creatures appeared. They were tall, thin, their grotesque bodies covered by interlocking bone plates, giving them the appearance of natural armor. They had no defined facial features, just a small deformed head that seemed out of place compared to their skeletal body. My eyes fixed on their hands, ending in pointed claws that seemed designed to destroy. I felt terror taking over me, and I fainted. When I woke up again, the creatures were there, right in front of me. They seemed to be conversing among themselves, but they didn't speak. They communicated telepathically. Their gestures were slow, methodical, but they emitted no sound. I watched, paralyzed by fear, as one of them pressed a button on a strange device he wore on his arm. Suddenly, the lights in the room intensified, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. The walls of the room were covered by huge incubators, each illuminated from within. I got as close as I could, still inside my invisible prison, to see better what they contained. What I saw chilled my blood. Inside those incubators were humans, people from different eras, some with ancient clothing, others of more modern appearance. The most disturbing thing was their condition. Some were atrophied, while others seemed to be trapped in different stages of human evolution, as if they had been manipulated and altered in horrible ways. They were like failed experiments. What followed was something I'll never forget. The creatures, those deformed beings, began their experiments on us. They treated us like animals, as if we were simple objects for their experiments. They had no compassion, and what they did to us was indescribable. 6 of us had been taken. 3 were subjected to psychic experiments, and the other 3 to physical experiments. The engineering student was one of the first to suffer. I saw it from my glass prison. They opened his head with a scalpel, without anesthesia, without any care. I saw how they introduced technological needles into his brain, piercing his consciousness as if it were a file they could read, modify, or even extract. The pain on his face was indescribable. The freight worker was subjected to something even more macabre. I saw him as they introduced him into a capsule filled with a thick liquid. That liquid began to decompose his body quickly. It was like watching someone disintegrate alive. Then they tried to reconstruct him but failed. They left him as a mass of deformed flesh and bones. Anna Weber, the pastor's daughter, was the one who suffered the most. They mutilated her, cut out her organs, tore them from her body, and then tried to transplant organs from other species. It was as if they were seeking to mix her with something non-human. Anna became a kind of hybrid, a monster that could barely be recognized. She lived in that state for a few days, but eventually died. Her body couldn't withstand the horrible transformation that the creatures imposed on her. Meanwhile, my father, the pastor, and I were assigned for their psychic experiments. They subjected my father and the pastor to mind control. They implanted devices in their brains. I felt that with each passing day, they were losing a part of themselves. They put me in a state of deep sleep. They invaded my consciousness, explored my thoughts, my memories. It was as if they were tearing my soul out. But the worst came later. They tried to make consciousness exchanges, forced the pastor Georg Weber's memories into me. And then I understood everything. I discovered that Georg had helped cause the train accident. He had broken down the locomotive system, facilitating the short circuit. He and Anna had already been abducted before, and Georg had made a desperate pact with the creatures to save his daughter's life, who was already sick from the strange experiments they had been subjected to. In exchange, Georg agreed to help them capture people for their procedures, but the creatures betrayed him in the end, and Anna paid the price. We were around 10 days in that experimentation room, subjected to their whims. Once, I saw the creatures do something that left me breathless. They brought back to life a man who was in one of their incubators. They placed a small patch on his neck, and I saw how he revived, only for them to begin experimenting on him again. At some point during those endless days of torture and experimentation, the creatures began to communicate with me. They didn't speak with words, at least not in the way we do. They transmitted their thoughts directly to my mind. It was as if a wave of voices flooded my head, a cacophony of ideas and sensations that I could barely process. I tried to resist at first, but it was useless. My mind was naked before them. They could read each of my thoughts, my fears, my doubts, but at the same time I could also feel fragments of their thoughts. I filled them with questions. I wanted to understand what they were, what they wanted from us, why they did what they did. And then, in the midst of that telepathic connection, I received the answers that chilled me to the bones. Their purpose was clear. They weren't simply curious beings or alien scientists in search of knowledge. They wanted to manipulate humanity. Their ultimate goal was to completely subjugate our planet, extract its resources, and turn us into their slaves. They saw us as an inferior race, a source of biological material and energy. They called themselves Carnos, an ancient and powerful race whose scientific and technological advances were far ahead of anything we could imagine. They told me that by the beginning of the next millennium, their preparations would be complete. They would have perfected the techniques necessary to take total control of Earth. Their invasion wouldn't be immediate, but gradual, calculated, infiltrating our societies until we were completely theirs. We were nothing more than pieces of their experiment. They were studying our bodies, our minds, our psychic abilities, all in order to create the perfect method to subjugate us. When the time came, the horrors that were only the beginning of what was to come. At the end of it all, when the creatures no longer had any use for us, they decided to get rid of the few of us who remained intact. They threw us among the wreckage of the accident like garbage. When I woke up, I saw that my father and Pastor Georg Weber were dead. They had been discarded like broken objects. I was dying, barely clinging to life, but not completely defeated. I remember their words in my mind. "We're not going to kill you, but you'll die on that mountain. You're weak, and we don't want to dirty our hands with the death of a child." They left me there, lying among the corpses, as if my life was worth nothing. I felt trapped in an endless nightmare. The first thing I did was look at my pocket watch. It was an instinctive reflex, something I did without thinking. I had seen the time just before we were abducted, and when I looked again, I couldn't believe it. Only an hour had passed. Everything we had experienced on that ship, the endless tortures, the days of experiments, the terror, all of that occurred in less than an hour. I couldn't understand it. Time had been manipulated in a way I would never understand. It was as if the real world had continued its course, oblivious to our nightmare. Still in shock, I remembered the reanimation patch I had taken from the ship. I placed it on my father's neck, and as his body reacted, as he slowly came back to life, something in him had changed. He wasn't the same man. The trauma of what we had lived through had broken him. I had changed too. We were nothing but shadows of who we had been. Shortly after, a rescue team arrived at the accident site. They found us among the remains of the train, surrounded by death and destruction. No one believed us when we tried to tell what had happened. For them, we were just survivors of a terrible accident, nothing more. The truth was buried with the bodies and the remains of the train. I'm so traumatized that I can't even talk about this. I've lived with this weight all my life, knowing that they're out there, waiting, but they'll return. Their plan is still in motion, and when they're ready, they'll finally execute their invasion of Earth. Before the middle of the 21st century, they'll be here. No one is prepared for what's coming. I can't stop thinking even today about what I heard. My grandfather's words, his voice loaded with terror and desperation, still resonate in my head. How is it possible that this has been hidden for so long? What do I do now? How can I move forward knowing what I know? They're out there. My grandfather knew it, and now I know it too. I don't know when, but they'll return. He made that clear, and we're not prepared. With trembling legs, I left the attic, trying to leave behind the weight of everything I had heard. The cold air hit my face, but it didn't calm me. Outside, the world went on, oblivious to the threat that loomed over it. I kept my gaze fixed on the sky, as if waiting for a sign, anything that indicated that time was running out. They were already here. I didn't know it, but what I did know from that moment on is that time was running. They'll return. My grandfather had said it clearly. The deadline is before the middle of the 21st century. I know the world isn't prepared to face what's coming. No one is.